Welcome to Wentworth Woodhouse. This is the largest private residence in all of the UK. It really is one of Yorkshire's hidden gems. Just look at the sheer size of it, the grandeur, the beautiful architecture. The facade, which is the largest in all of Europe, is over 600 feet long, making it the length of nearly 10 London buses. And inside is no different. There are over 5 miles worth of corridors and over 300 rooms, an estimated one for nearly every day of the year. But this raises a few questions. Well, more than a few. Why is it built here? Who built it? And why is it so chuffing big? To answer these questions, we are here to explore over 1,000 years of family history, to discover the architectural origins of this house, and to uncover the secrets of Wentworth Woodhouse. When I was 9 or so, my granddad took me here, took me down the path and said, "Josh, you aren't ready for the size of this place." Indeed, we got to the front and I looked up and went, "Wow, Grandad, that's massive." And he turned to me and said, "They're just the stables." Sure enough, when we turned the corner, my jaw hit the floor. I truly wasn't ready just for how big this place really is. It really is one of Britain's most remarkable buildings. But to find out its true origins, we must venture over 1,000 years into the past. There has always been a house here, just not as big as the one that we know and love today. The original estates predate the Norman invasion of 1066, and the family that were here were Saxons. The original estates were known as Wentworth, literally meaning winter house, so a place that was used for dwelling during the cold. These estates were pastoral and owned by the canons of Bolton Abbey. They were inherited by a man named Reginald de Wentworth, literally meaning Reginald of Wentworth, since surnames weren't really formally established. His 8th descendant, Robert de Wentworth, married a woman named Emma of Woodhouse, of the Woodhouse family that was local here, in 1250. They inherited the estates and upon doing so, named them Wentworth Woodhouse. The house was rebuilt and passed down generations to the 11th great-grandson of Robert and Emma, a certain Thomas Wentworth, the Earl of Strafford. The Earl of Strafford, born 1593, was a major figure leading up to the English Civil War. He was an MP for Yorkshire and also Deputy of Ireland. He was an avid supporter of the Crown later on in his political career, and thus he was rewarded by the King. But ultimately, over disputes between Parliament and Crown over how much power the King should have, King Charles I reluctantly sacrificed the Earl of Strafford to try and appease Parliament. He did this reluctantly, and in May 1641, the Earl of Strafford, who lived here, was beheaded. I must say, it is quite tragic actually that sacrifice was in vain, as a year later, the English Civil War erupted anyway. The house that Strafford lived in has barely any evidence left today. Some of the oldest architecture in the building is the well gate, so called because, well, it was a gate that once led to a well, surprisingly. The house that stands behind us today actually dates back to 1724, and it is an architectural phenomenon, not just for its size, but it also is 2 houses essentially built together as one. And it was primarily built out of a bitter family rivalry. Thomas Watson Wentworth, the first Marquess, was born in 1693 and was the great-nephew of the Earl of Strafford. He inherited the estates instead of his cousin, Thomas Wentworth. This angered his cousin, and thus he began a family war that spurred on the creation of 2 colossal buildings. The first Marquess of Rockingham was a prominent Yorkshire politician. He began building the west front, or as it's comically known, the back front, which is the opposite side to where we are now, in Baroque style by 1724. However, his cousin, Thomas, began building the nearby Wentworth Castle by 1727 in an attempt to overshadow the Marquess and indeed the house. Determined to outshine his cousin, determined to impress his political allies, and determined to showcase his status, the first Marquess began building the Grand East Front, aka the entrance today, in 1734 in a fashionable Palladian style. The sign above the portico there reads Mea Gloria Fides, meaning faith is my glory, which was the Rockingham motto. The Marquess was so fixated with the title Rockingham, possibly to distance himself from the family feud, but also because it was a very noble and unique title. It comes from Rockingham Castle, as the first Marquess was a direct descendant of the owners of the castle. He also changed the name from Wentworth Woodhouse to just Wentworth House. The house was finally completed in 1750. It took 26 years to build and nearly £82,500. In today's currency, that's a staggering £9.5 million. Unfortunately, however, the first Marquess actually died in 1750, apparently drinking himself to death, and thus never got to really see or appreciate the legendary house that he had built. His vast estates and the house were passed to his son, Charles Watson Wentworth, the second Marquess of Rockingham. Charles Watson Wentworth, the second Marquess of Rockingham, was the first Prime Minister from Yorkshire. He was also so popular with America for his kindness towards them. Thus, the city of Rockingham in North Carolina was named after him. Born in 1730, not only was he a renowned politician, he was also a renowned gambler. The famous St. Leger races, for example, were nearly named the Rockingham Stakes in his honour. He also had the massive stables built by 1782, which at the time were the biggest in the country, housing 84 horses there and thereabout. He also owned a particularly famous racehorse known as Whistlejacket. The name Whistlejacket is thought to come from an old remedy for a specific type of cold round here. In 1759 alone, it won Charles Watson Wentworth, the second Marquess of Rockingham, 2,000 guineas, which in today's money, from one horse alone in 1 year, would have been £204,000. There's no wonder, therefore, that it gets its own room in the house, called Whistlejacket Room. The portrait in there, painted by George Stubbs, is nationally recognised. It's a beautiful portrait. But the photo that currently stands in there is actually a replica, as the original was bought by the National Gallery for £11 million. Other notable rooms in the house include the Pillared Room, which is the entrance hall today. This has remained largely unaltered since its creation, save for a gas explosion that occurred in 1904. Then of course you get to the main staircase, and are greeted by the most notable statue of Ceres, the Roman goddess of agriculture and fertility. This is supposedly have been recovered from an expedition to Herculaneum, which was the sister city of Pompeii, and the main staircase takes you all the way up to the famous Marble Saloon. The Marble Saloon is described as being the finest Georgian room in all of England, and has been used to entertain guests for centuries, including royalty. The Watson Wentworths also built another type of architecture on their estates: follies. Follies were an architectural phenomenon that took the UK and France by storm in the 18th and 19th centuries. Indeed, they were called follies, derived from the word foolish or folly, as they were buildings with very little to no actual purpose, or purely ornamental for design. The first folly built by the Watson Wentworths was the Needle's Eye. Built by 1730, It was originally called the Needle because it looked like a needle head. The archway was added in the 1800s, as was the urn on top, and thus gained the name Needle's Eye then. There is also the Huber stand, so called because it is situated in the hamlet of Huber, and a stand was an ancient term used to describe an elevated place to observe a hunt. Built by 1748, it was constructed to commemorate the crushing of the Jacobite rebellion in 1745. Then there was Keppel's Column, built in 1780 after 7 years of construction. It was dedicated to Admiral Augustus Keppel by Charles Watson Wentworth, who were political allies. Unveiled on the 1st of October 1780, Charles and Keppel were on the top of the column, as there is a viewing platform on top there, entertaining crowds that cheered the unveiling. At 115 foot tall, this is the tallest folly in South Yorkshire. Then there was the Rockingham Mausoleum, one of the only follies not built by the Watson Wentworths. It was instead built by the 4th Earl Fitzwilliam. Charles Watson Wentworth died a childless but happily married man, married to Mary Bright. Thus his estates were passed down to his nephew, the 4th Earl Fitzwilliam. He inherited them upon Charles's death in 1782. Construction of the mausoleum began in 1783 as a way to commemorate his uncle. The Fitzwilliams, who then inherited the house and the estate, reigned here until they left in 1989. The 4th Earl Fitzwilliam is without a doubt my favourite historical figure. He got his wealth from coal mines and the over 100,000 acres of land he owned in England and Ireland. He sunk Elsa Canoe Colliery in 1795 and installed the Newcomen beam engine to pump water out of the shaft. Wentworth Woodhouse was built so big partially to accommodate large number of guests and to impress any visiting important guests. Boy, did the 4th Earl Fitzwilliams really host some massive parties while being here. In 1789, for example, after a visit from the Prince of Wales, there were over 1,000 guests in attendance, and they served 8 tons of food. And then at another party in 1807, 600 guests were welcomed, by a full military band no less, to a full feast inside. The public outside were also treated to some food, and by some food I mean 12 roasted sheep. But that was seriously nothing compared to the food that was being served inside the house. Inside, they were treated to 14 sheep, as well as 3 calves, 10 hams, and 54 chickens. And then that's still nothing compared to the amount of alcohol that was being served. In one night alone, they were treated to 32,000 pints of ale, 473 bottles of wine, 23 gallons of rum, and 18 gallons of brandy. They really, really did not do parties by halves here at Wentworth Woodhouse. The 4th Earl Fitzwilliam also restored the name Wentworth Woodhouse back to the house in the 1820s, after the first Marquess changed the name to Wentworth House. He also added another storey to the 2 wings by 1806. However, a century and a half later, we were to see the downfall of the house, and indeed the Fitzwilliams themselves. For example, in the Second World War, the house was actually taken over by the military and was used as the headquarters for the intelligence corps, whose main responsibility was literally gathering intelligence for the war effort. The grounds where we're stood right now were actually once used for motorcycle training, and the vast stables that once housed horses actually at one point housed soldiers. However, it was the open cast mining that really damaged Wentworth Woodhouse. Emmanuel Manny Shinwell, MP for Fuel and Power, was opposed to aristocrats and thus declared that the coal under Wentworth Woodhouse in the Barnsley seam needed to be exploited, as coal was in high demand after the Second World War. Studies showed that the coal wasn't really worth getting, and everyone, ranging from local miners to the government themselves, argued that the mining shouldn't go ahead as it could damage the house. Alas, Manny Shinwell pushed ahead and dug right up to the doorstep of the west front. And the tragedy didn't end there for the family either. The 8th Earl Fitzwilliam, Peter, who was romantically engaged with the sister of JFK, Kathleen Kennedy, was killed in an air accident in 1948. Heavy death duties, the nationalisation of coal, and the damage done by the mining meant that the Fitzwilliams could no longer afford to keep the deteriorating house. Thus, in 1989, they were forced to sell it. And after 200 years, the Fitzwilliam dynasty that once reigned supreme here had come to an end. But that is not the end of Wentworth Woodhouse's story. Nearly 30 years later, it was purchased for £7.6 million from the Wentworth Woodhouse Preservation Trust. The near 300-year-old house had been saved. In 2020, the scaffolding had been taken down and Wentworth Woodhouse had been restored to its former glory. And I'm overjoyed by that. Not only is this a massive part of my childhood, one of my favourite places to visit, it's also a monumental and very important piece of local Yorkshire history. Nowadays, it's open for visitors to come and enjoy. Whether you want to go on a tour or explore the gardens, you can always come here to Wentworth Woodhouse and discover the secrets of this grand private home.